Good morning. Okay. I'm having one of those days, you know. I don't know. Do you have days like that? Yeah, okay. You know, where I'm not exactly sure what's happening, you know. But I'm basically with it. Anyway, thanks very much for being here today. I am your substitute teacher today. Be nice, please. Kathy Jackson was unable to be here today, and she asked if we could, if I could substitute for her, so I am subbing for her today. I will be speaking on a different topic from hers, so I hope that it's okay. This idea came about, the idea for my talk today came about because of last week's talk that I gave about the wish to be of benefit to beings and the power of that, and the transformative power of what we call mind training, the training in love and compassion. And during the week, I got a really insightful email from someone who saw the talk and said, well, it's all well and good. It's all well and good to wish to be of benefit to all sentient beings. And it's all well and good to practice patience toward those who are, who we don't agree with and this sort of thing. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. But what about evil people? What do we do about evil people? And I'm like, uh-oh, I didn't address that. So this week, I did some deep thinking about that. And I thought about the teachings that I've heard and read over the years about the question of evil and how Buddhism works with this idea. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to give a short talk on what I have learned in my time studying with Buddhist teachers about evil, and then maybe we can reason together and help each other cope with what we perceive of as being evil in our world. And so that's where I'd like to go today. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion at the end. So if you have questions that are brewing, make a note of them, because we'll have a discussion partway through. So at the beginning of all of our presentations, we like to do a prayer of intention, setting our intention for the gathering and setting our intention to be of benefit to others. So we'll begin with the recitation of the refuge prayer, which we will recite twice in English and then chant in Tibetan. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the assembly most excellent, I take refuge until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of generosity and other good deeds, may I achieve enlightenment for the sake of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the assembly most excellent, I take refuge until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of generosity and other good deeds, may I achieve enlightenment for the sake of all beings. Okay, now in Tibetan. O Sanjay Chudan Soji Chonamla Jang Chu Pardu Dani Kyap Suji Daji Jinso Jibe Sunam Ki Drola Penshir Sanjay Druparsho. Okay, thank you. I'll say a brief prayer of my own, then we'll get started. O Palden Sawe Lama Rinpoche Dagi Chior Pede Den Shula Hadrin Jembo Ganeche Sunte Kusan Tugging a Drip Sal to Soul. Okay, thanks very much. So, it's very interesting that I decided to speak today about the evil in the world and how Buddhists look at it, because a friend of mine, one of my Dharma friends, sent me an email this week saying, do you have any observances planned for September 11th? And I realized that, that this would be a marvelous opportunity to speak about evil in the world on days that remind us of the evil that people do. And so this may not be the world's best teaching on evil, but we're going to have like a heartfelt moment, I think, together here today. I'm going to tell just a brief story at the beginning about going to see a Broadway show. It's not exactly about the horrors of 9/11, but it's touched by that. I went to see a Broadway show called Come From Away. It was in the first 2 weeks that it was playing on Broadway, and I felt very lucky to be sitting in the front row. And those of you who have seen it since, it has been broadcast on television since. I believe Apple TV Plus has it, and a couple of other streaming platforms have it. I do recommend it, because it talks about how one group of people coped with the horror at a very, very far remove from the events of September 11th. So I'm watching this show, and the opening sequence is everyone in this town in Nova Scotia, or actually it's way out there on the Rock. They call it Welcome to the Rock. They're on this amazing island in Newfoundland, just off the coast of Canada, Nova Scotia. And they are islanders and self-sufficient people, and they're proud of their self-sufficiency. And they talk about this very mundane day when the police officer was at the side of the road catching speeders, and the school teacher was opening the class for school, and they're all singing, you know. And suddenly someone says, turn on your radio, turn on your radio. And then everything is silent. And then the chorus begins to sing, you are there in a moment. And like at that moment, we knew what it was really all about, because we all shared that moment. You are there at the start of a moment, sort of at the edge of the known world. And it was a really beautiful moment to remember our vulnerability as human beings, and to remember how we felt in that moment, and how different our world was before that moment and after that moment, and how our perception of ourselves and the world changed in that moment. All they had to do was sing that one line, you are here at the start of a moment, on the edge, you know? And it was really a powerful moment of theater that helped us all have like a collective moment of remembering, but remembering with a shift, in that it's now in the past, and we can see what resiliency we developed in the time since. Now, this doesn't mean that that's the only kind of evil in the world. There's everyday evil that happens in our world, not just the big things, where one group or one nation attacks another nation. It's not just the warfare we see in the world. It's also these moments of aggression that we experience day to day. Whether it's because of our gender, or whether it's because of our life, whether it's because of how we look, we have all felt aggression from other people. And it happens on the daily. It happens every day. And so how do we deal with these moments where we are receiving aggression? Whether it's the big kind or the little kind that is telling us that it is not safe to be who we are. So we have to have that resiliency and build that resiliency in us to know that we have each other at these moments. And that's what the performance of this theatrical piece went on to tell us. The stories that unfolded in this theatrical piece told about the resiliency of individuals and how they coped by working together across cultures, across languages, when several plane loads of people had to land in Newfoundland because the US airspace was closed. And so the stories that are told in this theatrical piece were true stories of real people who all had to land in Gander, Newfoundland, and spend several days together in emergency shelters while they were waiting to find out what had happened and if they could go home. And some of the drama comes from the casual and callous racism and that some of the people experienced. But also, it also spoke of the kindness and the generosity of spirit of the people who were willing to reach out and be with another person in their identity and with them in the place that they're at. And I said to myself, wow, that's kind of like a Buddhist theatrical piece. It's kind of like a Buddhist thing about how we can, by working together, work to lift everybody up. Because that's the function of art in all of its expressions, is to lift us up so that we can be in this world and experience the feelings we experience and help each other through the difficult times of our life. So I had to start by talking a little bit about the experience of September 11th in order to frame the discussion about evil and how Buddhism works with the concept of evil. And this came about, as I said, because of last week's talk, where we talked about working with people who think differently and who see themselves differently, and how to deal with sort of the casual difficulties of our day. And that's why the person said, but wait a minute, aren't there evil people in the world, and how do you deal with them? You can't just be patient with them, and so on. And so I thought it would be useful to talk about that. So from the standpoint of Buddhism, there was, in my research this week, one of the conversations I read was a conversation with a Buddhist who described the teachings of the Buddha as not saying that there was an absolute evil being in the world. Because as you know, some of the faith traditions of the world posit the dichotomy of good and evil as being personified as a deity who is all good and a demon that is all evil. And that, of course, in Buddhism, we're in a bit of a problem right away because we don't have a God figure, but we do sort of have a demon figure, but he's not all bad. This is because the Buddha taught, as we discussed last week, that all beings have a spark of goodness within them. And some Buddhist teachers call it basic goodness. Some people call it Buddha nature. In other words, they have a mind that has the capacity to know itself and to know itself completely. And be in that moment of knowing itself, be liberated from the tyranny of selfishness and all of its problems. And this is what enlightenment is said to be, this liberation from self-grasping that is the cause of so much of our suffering. If you remember the Buddha's basic teaching, the first teaching he gave after he attained enlightenment, he taught what are called the Four Truths. Suffering is part of life, suffering has a cause, suffering has a solution, and there is a path that leads to the end of suffering. Suffering being part of life, we sort of understand. Sometimes we would rather that we didn't have any suffering. We would sort of rather that maybe, and when we have suffering, we treat it like it was a misdelivered package from the post office. Like, this, I didn't order this suffering. Here, maybe this is yours. But suffering is part of life, and if we can come to accept and understand that, then that is the beginning of change, positive change for us. It's when we think that we're kind of special and shouldn't have any suffering, that we have a problem. But gradually over time, we can come to understand that if we can work with suffering in a different way, that we'll be able to be liberated from fear and concern. But when the Buddha taught about the cause of suffering, he didn't describe the cause of suffering as being something external. No, he said that it comes from within us. It is our own grasping and fixation that causes our suffering, because we have a concept of self, me or I. And this concept of self, me or I, is where all suffering begins, because I exist, I suffer. And my suffering is caused by this grasping and this thinking that I should have no suffering, and therefore when suffering comes to me, I resist. And this is what I call value-added suffering. It's value-added because one of my psychotherapists had a sign in her office that said, pain plus resistance equals suffering. I'm not sure I totally buy into that thinking, but it did inform me at the time. But this second noble truth, the truth of the cause of suffering being clinging and fixation, we fixate on people and ideas and things, but we also fixate on the concept of me. Some of us fixate on the concept of me as being the best. I'm the best. But some people fixate on self as being, I am the best at being the worst. And either way, it's still fixation. And we have to find a way through it. We have to find a way to confront it, get through it, work through it, and find another way to be. And that brings us to the third noble truth, because if he had just taught the first two, this would be an extremely bleak philosophy. Suffering's part of life, you caused it, sorry. But it doesn't work like that. It's saying suffering's part of life, some of it comes from within us, and there's something you can do about that. Because since grasping and fixation is the cause, this should mean that there's a solution to it, and the solution is letting go. Letting go, but you can't say to somebody who's suffering, just let that go. It's not very kind. So this is why the Buddha taught the fourth noble truth, which is that there is a path that leads to the end of suffering. And it consists of doing no harm, not to yourself, not to others, practicing virtue, which means taking care of yourself and benefiting others, and taming the mind through the practice of meditation. do no harm, practice virtue, tame your mind. This is the teaching of the Buddha. And so if we can see this philosophy, do no harm, practice virtue, tame the mind, right? If you can see that, you can see that evil in the Buddhist terminology, evil in the Buddhist way of thinking, is not an absolute. It's something that is in motion. It's something that is in motion. And so one of the things I read this week as I was researching Buddhist thought on evil says, Buddhists do not believe that human beings are evil, but they generally accept that humans create suffering through their greed, their anger, and their ignorance. Greed, anger, and ignorance. They create evil. So in other words, it's not that people are naturally bad. It's just that they develop in that way. The other quote that I read about this that really gave me some power is this one. This actually came from my wonderful colleague, Lama Tom. He said, as to the question of evil, he said, the evil we see is not a person or the things they do, i.e. the devil and all of the idea of a demon or a devil that is working always against us. That's not just the way that Christians personify evil. Buddhists do the same when they personify one of the four maras. And the word mara, M-A-R-A, is like obstacles. And so this is as close as the Buddhists get to there being a devil. And there are four maras. In the life story of the Buddha, there was a person named Mara who was trying to tempt the Buddha so that he would not become enlightened. So that's the story around the Buddha's enlightenment. But my teachers told me, Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche told me that there are four types of Mara. One of the types of Mara is our own mental afflictions, our own negative habits of reaction to people and things, when we react in anger, when we react in ignorance, when we react in attachment and clinging. That's the Mara of our own mental afflictions. But there's also the Mara of being personified in a body, because our body needs things. And because our body needs things, it wants things, and it has to go get things. So there's the Mara that is the embodiment of our situation in this world. There are two more, though. One of them is death, the Mara of death, which is what stops us from practicing our spiritual life. Because what's interesting about Mara is that Mara is not an evil being. It is an obstacle that prevents us from becoming Buddhas, any kind of obstacle. And so the four obstacles that prevent us from becoming enlightened beings are our own negative mental afflictions that take us over. I don't know if anybody in this room has not at some point been taken over by a mental affliction. I'd like to talk with you after, because it happens to me also on the daily, where I get overwhelmed by a negative mental affliction of my own, and I say or do something that I later regret. So we all kind of know this Mara. The other one of embodiment, because I wanted to be comfortable, I did this bad thing. Because I wanted to be happy, I did this bad thing, and so forth and so on. So I get the Mara of embodiment and having a body that needs things. And then the Mara that is death. We all have an understanding that there are so many different kinds of death, right? There's emotional death, there's spiritual death, there's physical death, there's all kinds of endings and partings in life. So that prevents us from becoming a Buddha if we die prematurely. And then finally, there's one more Mara, and this, you're going to be surprised by this one. It is the Mara called the Celestial Child, and it's from a legend. I won't bore you with the whole legend, but the bottom line is, it's called the Mara of the Celestial Child because it has to do with clinging to the peace that arises in meditation practice. Now, maybe you haven't experienced this. I have for just a little moment, right? And there's a moment sometimes for people where when they're sitting and meditating, they actually feel pretty good. Their body is kind of at ease, and their mind is kind of at ease, and everything is smooth. And you can kind of get to liking that. And if you get to liking that, it can become an obstacle to awakening, because you're going to kind of want, it's like staying in bed in the morning when you don't want to get up and you just pull the covers over your head and say, okay, 5 more minutes, please. Only this time it's like 5 more minutes in samsara, please. You know, I'm about to become a Buddha if I meditate deeply, but you know, it feels kind of good just to kind of be even. And so the Mara of the Celestial Child is the grasping at the pleasant feelings that can sometimes arise in meditation, and then not going beyond them, not seeking to go beyond them. So, as you can see, even the Buddhist concept of evil is not singular. It is all of the negative things that people do when overwhelmed by their mental afflictions. So even evil comes about because of causes and conditions. This was the Buddha's special teaching. At the time that the Buddha began teaching in India, there were 2 popular notions about what caused suffering in the world. One theory was that the gods caused it. Kaboom, you know, the gods caused suffering. That was one theory. The other theory was that there was nobody in charge and it was all chaos. And things didn't happen for any reason whatsoever. So, with these 2 extreme views, very popular in India, the Buddha decided to teach something in the middle, which is why his philosophy eventually became called the middle way. He said, all things come from causes. In other words, you can't plant wheat and get corn. You can't harm others and feel lasting happiness. You might have a moment's satisfaction, but then it soon gives way to all the people who are chasing you because of that bad thing you did. So the idea here is that the Buddha said that we have the opportunity to make the causes of happiness by being kind, generous, and good. And that we also have the chance to make the causes of suffering by being selfish, greedy, hateful, and ignorant. And so, in a way, evil is not a being, it is a part of us. Several weeks ago, I shared with you the famous poem by Thich Nhat Hanh, Please Call Me by My True Names, where he heard of a tragedy at sea that happened in the refugee flotilla that left Vietnam at the end of the Vietnam War, and that a child had been harmed in the most horrible way. And he was asked to say something about this horrible tragedy of this child who jumped in the ocean after being violated. And he responded by saying, if conditions had been different, I could have been that sea pirate who harmed that child. If I had been born in that situation, in that place, in that time, that could have been me. but I am also that child. And he said, I have been everything in my past, many, many past lives. And so I have to recognize that even in the personification of evil that we see in this world, we possess the same potential for that evil. And we have to work with that, and we have to face that. That at any given time, we have a full set of criminal tools right here. Right here, this is it. We've got a full set of criminal tools, and we can do anything with this body, speech, and mind. And this is why I think that the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths first, because they were the most important, especially that last one. Do no harm to yourself. Don't do harm to others. Practice virtue. Take care of yourself. Protect and benefit others. And then tame your mind so that gradually we can become free in our minds, even if we're incarcerated and with our bodies and different types of suffering. So you got the idea here that evil is not an absolute. It's a thing that people produce themselves. And of course you might say, well, is there any hope in a world in which evil seems to be running rampant at the moment? At the moment, you know, in a lot of places in the world, the bullies are in charge, and us other people are getting beat up. So how do we square this? And so I read these two verses regularly, and in the 8th century in India, a Buddhist monk was asked to give a talk, and giving this talk became this book. The talk that this Buddhist monk gave, which obviously lasted for hours, became the book, The Way of the Bodhisattva, or the Bodhicharya Avatara, if you pronounce it in Sanskrit. And so it says here that, well, here's what he says. As when a flash of lightning rends the night, and in its glare shows all the dark black clouds had hid, likewise rarely through the Buddha's power, virtuous thoughts rise brief and transient in the world. Whoa. Whoa, you know, just that moment where the lightning flashes, and then you see everything for an instant, and then it's gone again. Instant, and it's gone again. He said, likewise, rarely through the Buddha's power, virtuous thoughts arise. Because it seems like we're getting a pretty steady diet of evil right now. We're seeing a lot of it. Well, so he's saying, yeah, it is rare. It is rare. Thoughts of virtue arise briefly and transiently. But then he says, so you might think it's hopeless. But then he gives you hope in the next verse. He says, thus behold the utter frailty of goodness. Except for perfect bodhicitta, there is nothing able to withstand the great and overwhelming force of evil. So he acknowledges that evil is powerful. But he says that bodhicitta is more powerful. And bodhicitta can be explained, bodhi means awakening and citta means mind, and it's something we all have. We all have a mind, and that mind can wake up. I guess you could call that's the ultimate bodhicitta, is that we have a mind that can wake up from its slumber. So we have that potential to do that. And except for perfect bodhicitta, there's nothing that can withstand the overwhelming force of evil. In other words, liberation and freedom is what stands against evil. And so, and the other half of the bodhicitta equation is love and compassion, which lead us to states of goodness and lead us to states of awakening. So, in any case, this is the hope that is offered to us in Buddhism, that even in a world where evil is commonplace, that we have the potential to awaken from our own slumber, and we have the potential to awaken from our own variety of evil. And we can also help others as well. And so I have one more thing to read to you, and then we can have a bit of a discussion, because maybe there are some things that are missing that you'd like to hear. So here's what, let's see what Lama Tam said. Another way to look at the evil we see is to see it not as the presence of anything, but a lack of something. First of all, it is the lack of recognition of the nature of mind and the nature of all things. So we take our self-concept to be real and we cling to it. So you could say that evil is ignorance of our own true nature. It begins with the ignorance of our own true nature. We do bad things in ignorance. When we see people doing harmful things, we're inclined to get angry. People breaking into homes, taking advantage of others. But in one way, he said, the more appropriate feeling is in response is sorrow and compassion. We know that actions have their inevitable consequences, and in the case of those who do harm, it's more suffering. And then he said, but at the same time, as Buddhists, we protect ourselves against crimes and consequence them with justice and compassion. Then he says, I see others doing something harmful sometimes. I sometimes find myself saying, I could never be like that. I would never hurt others like that. I am better than them. So then their wrong becomes an occasion of my pride. Whoops, he says, not good. We have lived countless lifetimes during which we have inflicted unbearable suffering on others, so seeing others do wrong can be a time of looking at and acknowledging our own faults. So it's really interesting. We have all of these different viewpoints. But what I want to say is that there is a problem of evil, and in some faith traditions, they solve that by personifying it as a being who we then fight. But for us, in a way, it's ignorance. And we don't fight as much as we understand. We need strength, but we also understand. And so it's like the knowledge is the power in this situation. The knowledge is the strength to know who we are and what we have, and feel strong in that. So I think I better stop talking, because as you know, the Dharma talks here are only partially coming from this side of the room. The other part of the Dharma talk comes from everywhere else. You can add your thoughts, you can add your experience, you can bring your own truth and situation to this. You can share a story, you can talk about your own experience, or ask a question. We have now two question microphones on either side of the room, and you can feel welcome to approach them and speak and ask questions, because maybe this didn't answer your questions about evil in Buddhism, but maybe a question might prompt more knowledge to come forward. So what do you think? Questions, curiosities? Yeah.
Hello.
Hey.
Can you talk a little bit, I assume that there's a balance to be struck, because at this relative level, when we encounter someone who's doing harm, we have to take steps to protect ourselves and protect others.
Right.
And sometimes that can be uncomfortable and sometimes violent. So how do we strike a balance between the need to make change and hold people accountable with the bodhicitta of love and compassion and wisdom.
Yeah. You know, my own teacher, Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, was asked this question, and I think the balance is struck. It struck in knowing that allowing someone to do something, continue doing something harmful, is actually very bad for them. And so one of my teachers said, because someone asked, like, well, I have a friend who is in this abusive relationship, and they think they need to stay in this abusive relationship out of compassion for the abuser. What do you think about that? And the Lama said, now, just because you're compassionate doesn't mean you have to be wrong-headed. You know, he said it's never wrong to tell someone to stop hurting you. And so what I'm thinking is that we have to be smart about how and when we do that, and we will have differing levels of skill in addressing evil and the bad actions that we see others doing, right? We will have different levels of skill. Sometimes we'll be able to stop the harm. Other times we won't. And someone asked my teacher, Khenpo Rinpoche, about this one time. He said, this gentleman recounted a situation that he had encountered in which there were two people fighting in the street outside of his home, and he didn't know what to do. What was the correct response of a Buddhist in this situation of the two people arguing and getting violent in the street? And Rinpoche answered by saying, it does depend on your level of skill. He said, if you're skilled with conflict resolution, or perhaps he said martial arts, you know, he said you can go down there and sort it out. But he said, if that is not your skill, then you will have to call authorities to come and sort it out. But what if you can't even make that phone call? He said, even if you can't even make that phone call, if you're so terrified of what's happening that you don't know what to do, he said, you pray for the people involved in the altercation. And he said, and don't just pray for the person who you perceive to be the victim. Pray for both of them, because the person who's causing the harm is suffering too. They're suffering too. And so pray for them as well. And so the idea is that we have to see that while somebody is under the sway of their mental afflictions and doing these evil things, right? They're harming and hurting. They are also themselves creating horrible suffering for themselves in future lifetimes that we can have, I guess you could say, compassion in advance for, if that makes sense. But that doesn't mean we don't stop people from doing bad things. If we have the power to do that, then yes, we can do that. Somebody asked Khenpo Rinpoche, well, is self-defense ever permitted in Buddhism? And he said, if you can run, I would do that first, he said. And then he said, if you can't run, he said, then try to disable the person who's causing you harm. And if that doesn't work, he said, you have to make your choice from there. He said, but you have to understand that you should try to have a heart of compassion whenever you can for those who are doing harm, because it helps you. It helps you, because hating that person who's doing harm is not helping you at all. It's just building the causes in you for harming others in the future. Isn't that interesting? You know, it's like, right? And so he said, this is going to sound totally unrelated, but somebody asked him once, Rinpoche, what do you think about capital punishment? And he's like, okay. He said, we shouldn't. No, it's wrong to kill people. You know, it's wrong for the. And he said, and y'all should be careful about that. He said, you have to be careful when you watch the news. He said, you're a Buddhist and you're watching the news, and you hear that a killer, a dangerous criminal, has been killed, and you go, yay! And he said, that's not the attitude that you should have. Because never rejoice in the death of another person, never rejoice in the physical suffering of another person, never rejoice in the suffering of another person, because that's building something harmful in you that's not going to go away, especially if you keep feeding it. So he said we have to take responsibility for our own side of things. I hope that helps. Yeah.
Thank you.
I learned a lot about prayer from him for that reason. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lama Kathy. This talk is wonderful, although it is a evil subject. I believe that countries are like people also. They're just an aggregate of millions of people.
Yeah.
I believe that we, the United States, have perhaps done, if you want to rate it, more evil than other countries. For example, slavery, 2 million people were brought here as slaves over time. That time is, from 1609 to 1865, when the slaves were liberated. But that's about 20 generations.
Yeah.
So it's not just 2 million, it's, I don't know what, 100 million over the time? Well, at any rate, so I also think that our evil is against the earth. We pollute it and pollute the atmosphere with carbon and methane. And so that is sort of like being aggressive to another person. We're aggressive to the earth. I'll stop there.
No, I really appreciate you calling attention to these things, because I think that this is why the Thich Nhat Hanh poem, Please Call Me by My True Names, was so powerful, because it shows that even though we think of ourselves as good people, we think of ourselves like that, either we or our predecessors have done innumerable, uncountable, negative, harmful, horrible things. And being able to understand that and see that at any moment we could be a person who causes terrible harm, it's a sobering thought. And it reminds us of the importance of cultivating presence of mind. If we can cultivate presence of mind, then our reactions will change gradually over time. And we will cause ourselves less suffering, and we will cause others less suffering. And so there are these sort of pockets of goodness in us that we're trying to expand. And I like to think of places like this as pockets of these communities that are like pockets of goodness that are trying to help and be present for others. So I really appreciate you talking about that. Thank you. Yeah. We've got time for a couple more, if there's a couple more out there. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for your shirt. May I see your shirt? All right. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. That's lovely. Love, empathy, compassion, inclusion, justice, and kindness. Thank you. Yeah.
It's a good reminder for me.
I hear it. I hear it. We all need that.
So my question, I was reading a nonfiction book about the modern history of Tibet.
Okay.
And in it, it talked about the kind of justice that has been sought by self-immolation for Tibetan monks and nuns and lay people. And I'm just really curious about how that works within Buddhism as far as like not harming yourself, and yet the powerful reasons that they're doing it. It's confusing to me, so I'm wondering if you can speak to that.
Yeah, so you're saying that you have read, let me double check I get this, I heard it properly. So what you're saying is that reading a modern nonfiction book about the history of Tibet, you're curious about the examples of monks and nuns killing themselves by setting themselves on fire, yeah.
Yes.
As a way of drawing attention to what they feel is a genocide. Yeah, I understand. And the response that was given by His Holiness, the 17th Karmapa, he actually pleaded with them not to take their own lives. Mm. He said there are so many other ways to work for justice, and that harming one's precious opportunity, to become a Buddha in this lifetime. He said, basically he didn't say governments come and go, but he said there's a lot of these human inventions that are ephemeral and come and go, and he said it is more important to work for change in nonviolent ways. But there is always that dichotomy, isn't there? I go back to, I don't know why the movie Do the Right Thing was such a touchstone for me, but it was like the two approaches. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, two approaches, okay, right? And so it's like also talking about international policies. There's pacifist movements, but then there's also active movements. So like how do we do political action in such a way that it doesn't poison us from within? And I think that's really what we have to look at, the intention, and we can never truly know the mind of another person. So it could be that the persons who have killed themselves in this way were actually coming from a completely pure and right place, but that would be unknowable by someone like me and by many who would then maybe misconstrue and think that harming oneself is a good thing. So it's a very delicate problem. Because in the old days, and by this I mean the 90s, genocide was intervened, there was intervention when genocide was suspected. But these days they're not quite so willing, as human beings are not quite so willing to do that on behalf of other nations.
I agree.
Because there is so much danger. The weapons we now have are so dangerous that we don't quite know what to do.
Compassion fatigue is a big part of that too, I think.
Compassion fatigue?
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. That's an interesting.
So I work for the local rape crisis center, and compassion fatigue is something we talk about when we talk about the work that we do.
Sure.
In that there are tolerances for how much you can witness,
right,
and how much vicarious trauma you can take on,
right,
without harming yourself.
Right.
And still being
right,
able to help other people. And so
right,
that sometimes it's not watching the news because you can't
right,
take in that as well, or the
right,
person who spoke about the earth and
yeah,
the other evils that are happening in the world.
Yeah.
So I think as we watch the world burn and we
yeah,
watch all the acts of harm that you spoke
right,
about today,
yeah,
you can turn off because you can't take anymore.
Right.
And so learning more about compassion as we are
yeah,
here, I think, is super
yeah,
important, so that we can
right,
not become
I see.
like we need to be compassionate, and yet for most of us there's limits in how much we can take on.
I really appreciate you fleshing that out for me, because compassion fatigue means different things to different people, so I appreciate you offering your perspective on this from your own experience. Mm-hmm. And what I've seen just in my limited experience as a Buddhist chaplain, I'm not a qualified Buddhist chaplain by any means, but I've been called upon to be a chaplain in certain situations. And I also was part of the our home monastery experimented with a chaplaincy training program in the teens. I think, I can't remember, it was like 2012, 2013, 2014, something where we did 2 cohorts of pastoral care training. And when we talked about compassion fatigue there, it reminds me of something my teacher said. He said, "You're not a Buddha yet, so you will experience limits in your compassion. You will experience limits in your energy level. You will experience limits in your patience. You're not a Buddha yet. So you have to respect your limits and back up before you begin to resent the people you're trying to help." He said, because when you feel that feeling resentment for the people you're trying to help, that means you have actually exceeded your limit and you need to back up so you can be safe. And this was spoken by a man who was born in 1924 in Tibet and never saw an airplane until he rode on one. And it's in the 70s or something. But he was so perceptive about this because Buddhist teachings are not a cultural thing. Buddhist teachings are not an ancient thing, even though they came up. They're a human thing because it's about how we are as people and acknowledging our limitations and working with them and working to slowly expand those. And this is the function of the mind training tradition called Lojong, or mind training, where we gradually work with more and more difficult objects for compassion. And by starting with ourselves and then gradually working outward through a series of trainings to train us to have a different way of looking at and relating to suffering. And I'm hoping to teach something on this in the fall, a little later in the fall, but I really admire the work you do, and all of you who are active in helping others in any way, whether it's in your own families or in the community. I thank you for that.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's time for one more. Is there? Yeah. Okay. Oh, we have 2 more. Okay. Oh, no, were you going to ask a question? Okay. Well, let's see. We may have time for you. We'll start with Diane. Yeah, and then we'll come back to you.
Lama Kathy, thank you so much for your talk today. I find a little bit of enlightenment every time I listen to you, so thank you. I think sometimes in Buddhism we get a little bit confused about the concept of non-judgment. And in situations that are difficult, we often don't know what to do because, oh my gosh, I don't want you to think I'm being judgmental.
Right.
So I was on retreat in Plum Village, and there's the expectation that there will be silence from 9 p.m. until after breakfast. And so a few nights in a row, there was a group of women who would meet in someone's room, and they had a wonderful time. And they would laugh, and they would tell jokes, and it was very loud until after 10 o'clock at night. So a group of us were really annoyed by this, and we didn't know what to do. And we thought, well, we can't really confront them because it's not our job to be judgmental. And so we struggled with it. And the next morning we consulted one of the monastics and told her the situation. And she said, oh, no. Your first responsibility is taking care of the Sangha. And so when something happens that disrupts the peace and quiet of the whole Sangha, it's really your responsibility to handle that situation with wisdom and to make sure that it doesn't happen again. It's not about judgment or non-judgment.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to share was, speaking of Thich Nhat Hanh, he often said, we believe that we should not kill. And that's one of the basic principles of Buddhism. But he said, however, if you come home and your house is infected with termites, please call the exterminator.
Right, yeah.
And so there's a reasonableness about this, and I
Right.
think, in a way, I think of the middle way as, no, I'm not going to kill, but I will protect my Sangha and my home.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you sharing that. That's wise words. Thank you. I think we do have time for the, yeah. Yeah.
It's not a clearly
You
formulated.
might have to approach the microphone. Yeah.
It's not a clearly formulated question, but when you mentioned the karmapa, it's, saying something to the effect of, governments come and go, guys.
Yeah.
Don't kill yourselves. It suggested to me that his perspective was not so rooted in the personal, individual incarnation. Like, we have a brief span of time here,
I know,
and
right.
morality is dependent upon that, and we need to act dependent upon that. But he seemed to imply that he had a perspective of eternity. And I wonder if that's right in what I'm thinking. How does that affect my moral judgment, or
Yeah,
what is
I
right?
get it. Yeah.
The relative versus the absolute, something
I
like that.
actually think these two are related. I actually think these two comments are related because we as a group of humans decide on what we allow and what we don't allow. Very much like the not talking after dark and that kind of stuff. And we decide what will and won't happen in government and things like that. And what kind of society we want, right? It's a function of the people and all of that karma that we just talked about, all of that group karma of having done so much evil in the past that now we have these problems today. We have to accept responsibility for that and try to make our best of it, right? And from what I understand of what you're saying, I think I understand what you're saying is like, if we take the long view, which is how I always characterize the Tibetans, because the Tibetans I've known have all taken the long view, that it's like it's about who you are going to be in your next life. And he's basically, one of my teachers said, you do a lot of good in this life, and it's in a way he didn't use the word banking it, but you're basically doing lots of good in this life so that in your next life you have a better way of going, a better way of being, because the you who is going to be subsequent to the you are now, the subsequent you will thank you for it. Because I frequently, when something good happens to me, I say, thank you, former me. In a previous life, you did something good is happening, and then something bad happens to me, and I say, now shame on you, former me. Anyway, but you get the picture. But so the Tibetans do tend to take the long view of things, and they do see things as coming and going. But I do think that we all agree on specific sets of behaviors that are outside the norm and are harmful. The Buddha, instead of calling it good and evil necessarily, although those words get used a lot in Buddhist teachings, he called these actions, the good actions, he called skillful. And the wrong actions he called unskillful. So it's not even, you know what I'm saying? It's like not that the people are good and bad, it's their actions are skillful or unskillful. The strongest criticism I heard my teacher say about someone was, yes, they are very unskillful. Because their approach was very coarse. The person was a person who was almost always arguing with someone. And that was the deepest criticism he made, was that person is very unskillful in their relationships with other people. But we do have rules, and we have, just like the rules in the monastery that said no talking after 9, we have rules that we do try to enforce, and they are based on our basic understanding of being human and knowing what hurts. right? But I still don't know that I've completely grasped your question. So I think I'm missing a nuance in your question.
The thing that I don't know, struggling with is I can imagine the long view being used in an unskillful fashion.
Got it. Okay.
Like you could use it as a way
Yeah,
to
yeah.
close your heart off from
Right.
being overwhelmed by your limitedness. You know, I only have so much compassion to give.
Yeah. Okay.
How do you use the short view versus the long view skillfully?
Thank you. I really appreciate that clarification because I did totally miss that part of the question. I've been like a professional speaker for like 26 years or something like that, but I still miss nuances in questions, and so I super appreciate your patience. This is not the first time I've heard this, and I feel like it's a problem. It's a problem for us because we have to take both viewpoints seriously, right? We both have to take the long view of the long evolution of our individual selves and our society. We have to take that long view of evolution, but by the same token, we cannot take the long view as a way of saying the immediate view is not important. And I think that's a pivot point that I don't think I don't think there's any hard and fast rule. I think it depends on the individual. People ask me, can I be politically active and can I, as a Buddhist, can I go out and protest and so forth and so on? And one of my teachers said, well, it depends on what that turns you into. If doing that activity turns you into some person who thinks they're superior to others, then you got a problem and you have to work on that. See, so there's an intersection of short view and long view right there in the individual. Like, what does it do to us as an individual to be politically active? If we can mediate that, then I think we're going to have the short and long view thing mediated. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We're the laboratory for that.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, I appreciate your patience with the process. I did run over a little bit. Sorry about that, but I hope it was worthwhile. So I want to thank all of you for coming here and bringing your sincerity today to this gathering. And I always feel this room gets better every week because of what you guys bring to it. We're all bringing our goodness here and our curiosity and our willingness to just sit and be quiet, which is something I'm not good at. I just think we just keep bringing that and bringing that and bringing that. And so we're kind of infusing this room with aspiration and goodness. So I want to thank you for bringing that today. We can dedicate. It's the back of the sheet. It's a very Buddhist thing to do. We don't even keep our goodness. We dedicate it to other people. We'll just do this since we're running late, we'll just do it in English only today and dedicate all the goodness of our session to all beings and that they may all be free. We'll start with the words, by this merit. By this merit may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may we free all beings. The courageous Manjushri, who knows everything as it is. Samantabhadra, who also knows in the same way. And all the bodhisattvas, that I may follow in their path. I completely dedicate this virtue. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone. I look forward to seeing you next week. And I think you've already been reminded that we're having a concert, a benefit concert, Friday night at Ramblin' House from 6 to 8. Come and listen to music. We're calling it the Good Karma Benefit Concert. So, thank you.